Think about projectile motion. If this blue track is the path of an object moving in a vacuum, a projectile moving in a vacuum, is it the case that if there were a drag force of any kind such that it got bigger with velocity, it would stay within the path of this vacuum trail? As in, it would never be able to have a flight trajectory that goes outside of this curve. Hello everyone, and welcome to Watch Me Do Math. That's the question we're trying to tackle today, which is in fact an open question, hence the I want your physics opinion in the physics thumbnail. Physics thumbnail? YouTube thumbnail. So the reason that I bring up this question was because I was reviewing the IB topic 2.1 the other day, which is about motion, and one of the syllabus points is in regards to motion in a vacuum versus projectile motion in a fluid. And you did not need to do any of the drag calculations quantitatively, but you needed to know qualitatively what was going on. And I thought, if you take a certain point of over time that a projectile has ought to have traveled to, then it would be compared to these points which are about the path in a vacuum. A path subject to some drag force must have the projectile, after the same amount of time, be some amount lower and be some amount closer to the beginning on the horizontal axis than the vacuum path itself. But what was ambiguous to me was whether these points were on this side of the vacuum path or this side of the vacuum path. In other words, if this was the path of a projectile in a vacuum, is it possible that a projectile experiencing a drag force could go through a path something like this? Or is that illegal because it goes beyond the trajectory of the path of the projectile in a vacuum? This particular problem is interesting to me because I haven't actually been able to find a solution to it on the internet. Perhaps I don't know how to look, or perhaps it's something that people consider so obvious that there was no need to make any publication about it, which may actually be the case. I may just be blind and this might be a really obvious problem that I haven't figured out an answer to, but it remains something that has interested me for the past couple of days, which is why I wanted to make a video about it. So my theory is that this idea of the path of a projectile in a fluid being necessarily contained fully within the path it would take if it were in a vacuum, this sort of moving inwards of the path, which is what I'm going to call the drag hug, because, I don't know, it seems like an interesting and appropriate name for this effect, which probably has its own name in the technical world anyway that I haven't been able to find. Is this drag hug mathematically grounded on a mathematical basis? Like, is this pretty much certainly going to happen given what we know about drag forces? So some assumptions I'm making are that, firstly, both projectiles, in both cases, the projectile is the same, the angle at which the projectile is fired is the same, the amount of kinetic energy imparted to the projectile at the beginning, or sort of the initial velocity of the projectile, is the same, and the drag force strictly increases when the speed of the ball strictly increases, and vice versa, such that the drag force strictly decreases when the speed of the ball strictly decreases. And my theory as to why the drag hug effect is real is because if you take some velocity of the ball in the vacuum path the magnitude of this velocity, v0, is always going to be larger or equal to the magnitude of the speed of the object in the dragged universe, simply because, by definition, the object in the drag universe, after the first instant from which it is fired, because no drag force acts on the particle or projectile in a vacuum, but there is a drag force acting on the projectile in a fluid, then the velocity of the projectile in the fluid must decrease by a greater amount from the velocity than the velocity of the projectile in a vacuum due to gravity. If you were to put this in the sense of a change in velocity diagram, I would put it so that you have your initial velocity v0 in a vacuum, then your second velocity v1 in a vacuum will look like this. The horizontal velocity will be unchanged, and there will have been a change in velocity equal to the acceleration of free fall, g, multiplied by the time increment through which this change happens. And that's the only change in velocity that you'd get. But what I'm saying is, because there is an additional change in velocity from the fact that a drag force is acting on the motion of the projectile that is in a fluid, then you get sort of an additional decrease in velocity. I don't really know how you would draw this. I'm fairly certain that I'm fairly aware of the fact that drag forces need to act in the opposing direction to the motion of a body. But to draw a continuous line of drag forces is something that is a little difficult for me to visualize. I think either a curve like that, or just a straight line like this is most appropriate. But anyways, disregarding that for a moment, my point is that the velocity of a projectile subject to drag forces in this kind of system would be an even smaller v2, no matter what, because as long as this red line is acting in opposition to the velocity of the projectile, it will cause a greater decrease in its velocity than was only caused by gravity. And so, at least when both of these projectiles are moving upward, their velocities must be one must be greater than the other. The magnitude of the velocity of the projectile in a vacuum must be greater than the magnitude of the velocity of a projectile in a fluid, such as air or water. But that by itself is not enough to show that the drag hug is a effect built on a solid mathematical basis, because you can still have a low velocity and a trajectory that is outside of the vacuum path. For instance, if this is the vacuum path, you might consider this sort of quote-unquote rogue trajectory outside of the path, even at a very low velocity compared to the vacuum, the projectile in a vacuum, you might get something like this. Or at least, I think you might get something like this. Or that might be possible. So we need to show why the direction of the velocity of a particle in a fluid must point downwards, or point to the center at least, more so than the velocity of a particle in a vacuum, of a projectile in a vacuum. And I think that happens for two reasons. Firstly, if the magnitude of its velocity is less than the magnitude of the velocity of a particle or projectile which has been moving in a vacuum all this time, then the change in the angle or direction of its velocity So this change in angle must be bigger for the one with a smaller overall velocity, because the actual change in velocity is going to be constant no matter what the projectile is, but that percentage shift, or that shift in the angle, is going to be much greater if your overall velocity is much smaller, right? So like, it's like going from here to here versus going from here to here. So while the actual absolute change in velocity is the same, in a vacuum, it'll have less effect on the direction of the particle or projectile versus in a fluid, in air, because the projectile moving in air will be slower anyway. And the second reason that I think this is the case is because the drag force makes the one in air point down more than the one in a vacuum anyway, because there is nothing slowing the there is nothing slowing the vertical motion of a particle moving through a vacuum, but there is something slowing the vertical motion of a particle moving through air. And if that vertical motion is less, then I would be inclined to think that over time, with respect to time, the particle moves to a lower height. Or actually, this was a line of thought that I explored, but turned out to be not actually valid, because like, while the vertical speed may be reduced, the horizontal speed would also be reduced in a way that might not change the angle much at all. But overall, this drag force making the magnitude of the velocity smaller must mean that the overall effect on the angle is greater, right? So like, if you have a tennis ball and you throw it really lightly, it's gonna go like that, right? The angle at any given point is gonna drop pretty fast, because it's not moving very fast compared to the acceleration of free fall. If you throw it really hard, it might go like this. And that would be because the actual change in the direction of the velocity over time, well, this is just one way of thinking about it, but the change in the direction of the velocity over time is not so much, because the actual magnitude of the velocity is so high, or the magnitude of the horizontal velocity is so high. So it would go like that instead of this. But anyways, that sort of sums up my thinking process as to why this path ought to be inside the larger path. Essentially because the angle or the direction of the velocity is pulled down by the force of gravity more effectively if it is also being subject to the forces of drag and being made into a smaller absolute velocity. So yeah, so that's my explanation of this phenomenon, but the thing is, I'm not actually sure if that's correct. So I invite you to leave a comment as to what your thoughts are on this idea, or this phenomenon, this drag hug. Or definitely leave a comment if you know a already worked out solution to this problem, because I'd be really intrigued to see like, what is happening with it, or whether I am somehow mistaken, or something's gone wrong in my proof of this, or whether I don't have some piece of intuition that makes it obvious to the majority of people why such a fact would be the case. But in any case, I hope that this video was interesting for you to watch, and until next time, where I will be going through also any replies that I do get from this video, have a good week, and I'll see you next time. Subscribe if this helped you or you found it interesting.